Hey all, Alex here at your home of the Music Deep Dive, and today it is time for a review of the 1865 novel by Charles Dickens, Our Mutual Friend. This is the final complete novel published by the great English author Charles Dickens, which completes the journey that we have taken on this channel over the past 2 or so years now at this point, where we have looked at every single full-length Charles Dickens novel. There is a novel after this, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, that was left unfinished, although it was published after Dickens' death. Not sure if we're going to cover it on the channel anyways, but in any case, regardless, this is the last completed one. And, compared to the novels that came immediately before this, this is immediately after two of the sort of linchpin landmark achievements in Dickens' career in A Tale of Two Cities and Great Expectations. Our Mutual Friend is one that kind of slips under the radar a little bit, in the sense that it was a novel that was not received incredibly well when it came out. It was a novel that a lot of people had gripes about, as far as the plot construction of it, the characterization not being as vivid as past Dickens novels. And unlike some other Dickens novels that have sort of had a critical rejuvenation in later years, it's not that Our Mutual Friend hasn't had one, because it certainly has. But I think compared to other novels, like let's say something like Bleak House, I think it's a little bit less pronounced. I hear less people talk about Our Mutual Friend as a career highlight of Dickens. If people point to anything as being a positive in a relative sense from Dickens, pertaining to this specific Dickens novel, it's that he is trying to experiment with different ideas, whether that's his attempt at trying to incorporate more, I guess, progressive characterization, or whether that's his attempt to kind of wrangle a very complicated plot, one of his most complex, certainly to this point. People give this novel a lot of credit for that, and I think the Dickens aficionado finds themselves really appreciating this. So going into this, I had no expectations, and I was just kind of waiting to see if anything in particular would really grab me with this work, because in so many ways, the description of this does remind me of Bleak House, which is a novel that I did struggle with when I first went through it. And unfortunately, I think, fortunately or not, I don't necessarily know that you need to pass judgment on here. This is not a one-read novel. Our Mutual Friend is, in just the same way as something like Bleak House is not. And I think so much of that comes as a result of the plot. This is a dense plot that's revolving around, there's a central story here, in much the same way as something like Bleak House is, but it's surrounded by a bunch of these kind of side plots and side characters that all kind of dance around that core story, and sometimes are directly involved in it, sometimes are not. And it gets a little bit, you certainly go long passages where you feel like you are detouring away from that central conflict, and Dickens isn't always in a rush to get you back to that central conflict, I find, or that central kind of story track, if you will. Ultimately, this novel also revolves around, this kind of tale of mystery, I suppose. There's an air of mystery to this one. Not in an explicit way necessarily, but more so there is, it's essentially an entire battle over inheritance, right? And the person who was supposed to get it is presumed dead, and the person who did get it is under, is under pressure, and there's a bunch of themes about marriage, and marrying someone with wealth, and again, class discussions, as you get from pretty much any Dickens novel. And, in all of these different layers, Dickens is trying to do a lot of different things with the plot here. and with the kind of thematic elements, I suppose. Um, and I think, it's hard because I don't want to criticize a novel for going, in this case, a bit over my head, I suppose, as it were. And I understand that there is a degree of complexity in the sense that Dickens is really trying to challenge his reader here. How much of that is an intentional challenge and how much of that is limitations because of some other things that happened during the writing process, I'm not entirely sure. But I struggled to get a foothold on this book until pretty close to the end, when the plot threads were starting to resolve themselves. Some of the main characters' stories were starting to conclude, and I started to kind of understand the bigger picture idea of what was going on. Not that there isn't very clear foreshadowing. There's a huge twist in this book that is strongly hinted at very, very early on, and that twist comes to fruition pretty much exactly as you would expect. But otherwise, from a characterization standpoint, not one of my favorite Dickens novels. I do think that compared to other novels of his, this is one of the best sets of female characters that I think he's ever written. I think the character of Bella and the character of Lizzie are probably the clear highlights and really the anchors for me, in the sense that they were who connected me to the plot and who really made me feel some level of investment and connection to the story, I suppose. I think they are both strong-willed and opinionated, and there's a sense of moral. There's moral qualms at hand with their story, but also, I think just a sense of not purity, but I think that the character of Bella in particular goes through one of the most interesting evolutions of any character in this book, which I think is really rewarding. And I think the character of Lizzie is just one of the most likable ones that you'll get. She's again, that kind of like moral center throughout the whole thing. And everyone else, I think I struggled with. I think you have some characters that are, in there for more kind of comic purposes, or who come across more as caricatures, and they work effectively, I suppose, for what they are. But I don't know. I think that this is absolutely a novel where strong characterization takes a clear backseat to story structure and plot threads and plot kind of maneuvering, which is not really common for Dickens. I think even a lot of his most complex stories manage to do a really good job of preserving unique characterization, and oftentimes the characters are what save the book from being just really tough to get through. And this one, I just don't think that's the case. I don't think this is one of the stronger batches of interesting characters that he has to his name. And so, yeah, I think what we get here is a novel that teeters under the weight of its own narrative a bit. Just it's trying to do a lot, and I think I don't know, it wasn't enough to captivate me. And I do think that with the plot wrapping up in the way that it does, and seeing kind of all the intersecting threads connect to one another, I think that in itself will inspire me to go back. Again, I think much like Bleak House, I think this is a novel that rewards itself with multiple readings. And I think over time, I expect this to be a grower. And I think ultimately, when I contrast my own reaction with the general public perception of this novel, the initial idea being that this was kind of a lesser Dickens work that he ends up going out with, the fact that this has grown over time for people, and that people who really have spent time with Dickens' work will often anoint it as one of their favorites, I think that bodes well in the long run for folks, perhaps like myself, who want to kind of revisit this stuff and really let it kind of sink in a bit more. But as a first listen, or as a first read, I should say. There's a lot to be impressed by, I think, on a technical level. I just don't know if I was necessarily feeling the same emotional thread, the same clear narrative through line that I was with other Dickens works. I think it bites off a lot, and it's a fairly massive read, about a 700-800 page book. So, it's a bit dense. It's a little bit impenetrable, and not necessarily for the faint of heart. This is not going to be my first Dickens recommendation to anybody. It's not my least favorite Dickens novel, so I understand this sounds a little bit like a negative review. I don't think it's my least favorite by any means, and there will be a ranking at some point that will set that in stone, at least for now. But I do think I think the reservations that people have had about it for the whole time are warranted. It's pretty dense, and it's, as much as I think it's interesting that it foreshadows what Dickens' career could have been, like a late period Dickens, who was still writing in like the 1870s and 1880s and that sort of thing. I think more interesting novels could have come from this. Like, it kind of almost feels like a transitional novel, if you want to associate that terminology with it, like a transitional work for a later phase of his career that never actually happened. So I'm not sure if that's a popular opinion. I'm not sure how people feel about this novel. I'm curious to know what you think, but not one that grabbed me immediately, even though I do think there is a lot to be impressed by, and I understand the reasons why people are, some people at least, a minority perhaps, are as partial to it as they seem to be. With that, I want to say thank you all so much for watching. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. As always, more reviews are to come. Make sure to hit that bell for notifications and tell a friend as well. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you next time right here at your home of the Music Deep Dive.